James, you're with an organization called ICRD that the Cure PDX project has fortunately got a lot of time to work with, at least in the last few weeks. So just to start, tell us, what is ICRD? What do you guys do?
Well, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy is what that stands for. Kind of rolls off the tongue a little better as an acronym. But ICRD has been around now for over 25 years. It was actually founded by a former military officer by the name of Dr. Douglas Johnston, who wrote a book, I believe it was 1994, called Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft, when he was at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington. And his argument there was, in the world of realpolitik, we do ourselves a huge disservice not recognizing that faith has an extraordinarily important place in people's decision making writ large, but also about how we relate between different communities at the community level itself, but all the way up to geopolitical level. And he was kind of a one of just a couple of voices in the wilderness at the time, saying we really need to figure out how to do this and how to do it well. I think in the post 9/11 period, maybe that message became more resonant with people, but perhaps not in the best way, right? It was kind of, okay, religion is part of the problem, and we need to find a way to de-religify spaces or people or policies, particular religions, especially, right? Particular ideologies that were seen through a securitized lens more than anything. So ICRD was founded prior to 9/11 because Doug had wanted to put boots on the ground. He wanted to put together interreligious teams, people from different faith traditions that could go into places where faith identity was either part of a dynamic that was potentially leading to conflict or had led to conflict, or was an underutilized uh, asset within these communities that were trying to avoid or recover from violence. So he established ICRD. It was very small at first, and then really kind of took off before I joined. It started to engage in some bigger programs that were extended for years and years. For example, when it was first started, we did some work in Sudan to help move along the comprehensive peace agreement between the South and the North, with an interreligious committee that we set up there. We did some work in Kashmir and Afghanistan. But when I joined in 2011, we had started work in Pakistani madrasas, working with madrasa teachers to really re-establish the sense of pedagogy in these spaces around multidisciplinary thinking, around ideas of tolerance and inclusion, things that had been kind of excluded over time that were part of the heritage of the madrasa system from its inception, when it was, during the golden age of Islam, when it was really kind of uh, a model for what we now do in higher education in the West. And so the reason I use that example is because we really that's a great way of describing how we do it. We try to work at the culture and the faith of the space with which we are working. Now that program obviously was designed around what has since been called the preventing violent extremism lens, with the idea being that youth who are being trained just on um, rote memorization of their sacred texts, which they are in a language they don't actually even speak. There are very few Pakistani youth that speak Arabic, and then having it interpreted for them by others was really limiting their sense of, what the richness and what the availability of pro-social values were within those sacred texts. And so they were highly susceptible to recruitment by extremist organizations. So we came in working within the context of the faith, led by a Pakistani born Muslim, the program, because that's the kind of way that we try to engage what we do. So again, established to try to work on faith in conflict dynamic spaces, not because religion is necessarily a driver, but because, as Pew Charitable Trust said in one of their studies some years back, 84% of the global population self-describes as religious. And I think that a lot of times we try to think our way around or work our way around religion in these kinds of community-based programs or policy programs, but it's there anyway. And so if we don't take it seriously and if we don't understand it, someone is going to use it to their advantage, and sometimes their goals are not necessarily all that positive. And so we have four core objectives that I like to talk about. One is undeniably faith has been used to drive identity-based conflict and violence. And so one of our core objectives is to remove religion as a driver of violence. And I'll give an example of one of the programs that we did for about a decade. We worked with the Ministry of Education in Saudi Arabia on their textbooks. And we did this quietly behind the scenes and did not make it a big public program, primarily because there was a lot of sensitivity at the policy level with the Saudis around this. But they did want to understand why the West saw these texts as promoting intolerance. And so we worked with them on removing elements of anti-Semitism, anti-Shiism, a lot of the language or interpretations of the sacred text that then kind of push this idea that those who were not of a particular strain of Sunni Islam were not okay and maybe could be dealt with intolerance and even violence. And so for a decade we worked with them, and they really made huge strides in transforming those books. And some reports have come out recently through other organizations that have identified those strides that they have made, including a report that we did make public a few years ago. But the other three objectives are really about the kind of what I would call an asset-based approach to faith identity in places of potential or active violence. And the first one is to build the capacity of religious peace builders. So there are religious actors out there who find within their tradition the motives to try to get people to turn to alternatives to violence as a response to conflicts and crises. And one example I can give of that is we worked in Colombia with women of faith, Christian and indigenous and Afro-traditionalists, who had been working on kind of an interfaith conflict framework for a while. And we worked with them around reconciliation concepts and trainings to help reintegrate former combatants who were getting out of the FARC or the ELN or the paramilitaries as they were working their way up to and through the peace process between the government and the FARC. And so they were working at the community level to try to get people to understand how their faith inclined them towards and what were some of the methodologies that could be employed in reconciliation processes to help reintegrate these former combatants who were stigmatized. Another of the objectives is to create more religious peace builders, right? So it's pretty logical in that sense. And we worked for a long time in Yemen, actually prior to and then during the current violence that's there, identifying where tribal and faith leaders might play a bigger role in supporting community decision-making that would avoid identity-based conflict between the tribes and between communities where government really was somewhat absent. And in many cases, it was actually the extremist groups, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, who were offering some of these services, whether they were mediation services or whether they were social services where the government was absent. And we worked to help these faith leaders realize their capacity to do some of these things and thereby also isolate these very violent groups that are based on a violent interpretation of ideology. And there were comments from one of the programs I remember we did was to help install water, because one of the communities had a water program and the ones around them did not. So they involved the youth that were being recruited in this program. And at the end, I remember one of the young persons said, you know, we used to think the government had to do this stuff. And when they were no longer around, we turned to these outside groups. But now we realize we can do it ourselves. And so we don't want anything to do with these extremists anymore. And in fact, that group of youth from that program then went around, raised funds themselves to train communities, surrounding communities, to expand that project so that the impact was even greater than what we had initially envisioned. And then the last objective really is to try to tie in religious peace building with other kinds of peace building. A lot of times we silo out this kind of religious identity piece and religious action piece as though it's, you know, only for the religious or only for a religious problem, when it can actually be very effective as a when it's married with other kinds of actions. So I think of some of the research that we did to inform policy in North Africa on engaging conservative faith leaders as peace builders, where they were seen a certain way from the outside because of their religious identity. These were Salafi actors in particular, but many of them were Salafi actors who explicitly rejected the use of violence to advance their religious identity or their policy goals. And so they were not only were they great partners in that sense, but they also have the authenticity and the legitimacy in the face of or in front of the communities of youth who are sometimes being recruited into groups like ISIS. And so they can actually transform those attitudes in these target communities where, you know, a guy like me, an Irish Italian ex-Catholic Quaker from Boston, is not going to stumble into a garage mosque in the outskirts of Tunis and tell these kids, hey, you really shouldn't ought to be getting involved in this stuff. But these folks can. And so if we leave them out of the equation, then we are operating with one hand, kind of proverbially tied behind our back, so to speak. So we've done this work across the world. We've been active for 25 years now. We are not ourselves a religious organization, so we don't adhere to any particular faith doctrine, but we were founded by and are populated by religious people of all stripes and people with no faith, both as the practitioners on the team and the board members and supporters, because really it's not a matter of advancing one ideology. It's a matter of finding and elevating the best of our different traditions that religious adherents believe should be brought to bear to help solve common problems. And in this case, the problem of identity conflict and violence. And one last note, you know, we took that conservative religious actor engagement model and pivoted a couple of years ago to a domestic program, which was really our first significant domestic program. And as you know, having been connected to it, it is now a very important part of our portfolio. And I think that the needs are incredibly evident here. And in fact, in just the last few years, have probably gotten dramatically more evident because the polarization and the division in the United States is getting very scary. You know, it's to the point where people are operating with entirely different ideas of what's going on, and the ability to have them share a conversation in that space is greatly reduced. And one of the things that we have found is that there are a lot of conservative religious actors in particular who are having a hard time using their faith, their text, their sacred documents, even the spiritual core of their faith, to get people to hear one another. And in fact, some of them are getting thrown out of their jobs when they're trying to do this. And it's not just that we're aiming at conservatives over progressives or liberals or however you want to call it. It's just that where the faith element manifests more strongly around potential conflict and where that's an asset to try to make change right now, we're locating that work in conservative communities. But our goal in the end, obviously, is what it always is to build understanding and bridges of dialogue and collaboration, inshallah, between different identity groups. So that's a pretty wide-ranging response to your question, but that's roughly who we are and what we do. And again, we've been in over 25 countries across the world, from Myanmar through Saudi Arabia and Yemen into the Sahel, North Africa, into Latin America, now here at home.